In April of this year, researchers published a paper that nobody in the Pacific Northwest has talked about nearly enough, working from updated offshore seismic data and improved imaging techniques that were not available when the Regional Hazard Framework for the Pacific Northwest was originally built. They determined that the Juan de Fuca Plate, the tectonic plate that is slowly sliding beneath the North American plate off the coast of Washington, Oregon, and Northern California, is approximately 5 kilometers shallower than the models had previously estimated along key segments of the Cascadia Subduction Zone. 5 kilometers. That is 3.5 miles of depth that the old models had wrong. Here is why that number is not a technical footnote. Every building code in Seattle, Portland, Eugene, Olympia, and dozens of other Pacific Northwest cities was calibrated to seismic hazard models that assumed the plate was 5 kilometers deeper than it actually is. Every bridge design, every hospital retrofit, every emergency response plan, every school structural upgrade that was carried out over the past 2 decades based on those hazard maps was based on a plate geometry that is now confirmed to be incorrect. And according to the researchers themselves, that geometric correction alone translates to between 9 and 17% more intense ground shaking across affected areas during a major Cascadia rupture compared to what previous hazard assessments predicted. 9 to 17% more intense shaking, and all of the Pacific Northwest's seismic preparation was calibrated to the lower number. Scientists are monitoring the risk of a 9, 0 West Coast earthquake, and that is not the terrifying part. The terrifying part is what the monitoring just found. Let me explain what this means from the beginning, because I think the Cascadia Subduction Zone is the most consequential and least understood seismic hazard in North America, and understanding it properly requires starting from the basic physics before getting to the specific things that changed this year. The Cascadia Subduction Zone is a 700-mile-long fault that runs offshore from Northern California, up through Oregon and Washington, and into British Columbia. It is not a vertical crack in the crust where 2 plates slide horizontally past each other the way the San Andreas Fault does. It is a sloped interface where the Juan de Fuca Plate, a relatively small oceanic plate in the northeastern Pacific, is diving down and underneath the North American continent at a rate of about 4 centimeters per year. As it dives, it carries the seafloor beneath the leading edge of the continent, slowly pulling it down and backward, like a slow-motion collision between a vehicle and a guardrail, where the guardrail is gradually bending toward the road. The reason this produces the most dangerous earthquakes on Earth is a phenomenon called the locked zone. As the Juan de Fuca Plate subducts, the interface between it and the overlying North American plate is not a smooth surface. It is rough, irregular, and in many places strongly coupled, meaning the 2 plates are essentially stuck to each other, unable to slide freely. The plate is moving. The interface is locked. The relative motion that would normally be released continuously through creep is instead being stored as elastic strain in the overlying crust. Every year, 4 more centimeters of motion are stored rather than released. Every year, the strain in the rocks above the locked zone increases. When that stored energy releases, when the locked zone fails along enough of its length simultaneously, the energy comes out all at once. The magnitude of the earthquake is determined by how long the rupture is, how much slip occurs, and how stiff the rocks involved are. For a full margin CS-ZID rupture, the locked zone along the entire 700-mile length releases simultaneously. The overlying North American plate, which had been slowly bowed downward by the coupling, springs back. Coastal land that had been subsiding for centuries suddenly rises. Offshore land that had been compressing suddenly extends outward, and the seafloor deformation displaces the entire water column above it. That displacement is the tsunami, the shaking from a full margin of M9. 0 Cascadia rupture would last 4 to 6 minutes, not seconds. 4 to 6 minutes of continuous intense shaking across the entire Pacific Northwest simultaneously. For comparison, the 1994 Northridge earthquake that caused widespread destruction in Los Angeles lasted approximately 10 to 15 seconds. The 2011 Tohoku M90 in Japan, the event that generated the devastating tsunami and destroyed the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear plant, produced approximately 5 to 6 minutes of shaking in affected areas. That reference is not meant to be reassuring. Tohoku killed nearly 20,000 people and produced several $100 billion in damage in a country with the most advanced earthquake engineering and tsunami preparedness infrastructure on Earth. The Pacific Northwest is not Japan. The last time the full Cascadia Fault ruptured was January 26, 1700. We know this with extraordinary precision, and the evidence for the specific date comes from an unexpected source. In January of 1700, Japanese coastal communities recorded an unexpected tsunami. Unexpected because there had been no local earthquake, no ground shaking that Japanese residents felt. To explain it, Japanese historians documented this orphan tsunami, which arrived at the Japanese coast in the early hours of January 27th local time. damaged coastal infrastructure in several locations, and was noted in historical records precisely because it arrived without the usual earthquake forewarning that Japanese coastal residents had learned to associate with tsunamis. Working backward from the Japanese records, using the travel time of tsunami waves across the Pacific, researchers identified the source of the 1700 Japanese orphan tsunami as a rupture on the Cascadia Subduction Zone occurring on January 26th at approximately 9 p.m. local Pacific time. That date has since been confirmed through multiple independent lines of evidence, rings and trees killed by sudden coastal subsidence that ring date to 1699, 1700, oral traditions of Pacific Northwest indigenous peoples describing a great shaking of the land and a great wave that destroyed coastal villages, and ghost forests of dead Sitka spruce preserved at the new coastline elevation that formed when the land suddenly subsided during the rupture. That was 326 years ago. The average recurrence interval for full margin CSZ ruptures, based on paleoseismic evidence from buried coastal soils and offshore turbidite deposits, is roughly 500 years, though the range is wide, from about 200 to over 1,000 years between major events. We are about 65% of the way through the average interval. The probability estimates in the most recent literature are not comfortable. A proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences study earlier this year put the probability of a full margin M9 rupture at 15% within the next 50 years, and a partial southern rupture at 37 to 43%. If only the southern segment ruptures, the earthquake would be between magnitude 8.0 and 8.6. Still catastrophically destructive and still generating a significant regional tsunami, though smaller in total scope than a full margin event. The 1700 event's full consequences were recovered only through painstaking historical detective work that unfolded over decades. In the 1980s, a USGS geologist named Brian Atwater was excavating tidal marshes along the Washington coast when he found a layer of sand buried beneath marsh peat, the signature of a sudden submergence event that allowed marine sediment to deposit on land that had previously been above tide. The same pattern appeared at site after site along the Pacific Northwest coast. A land that had been marsh suddenly dropped by several feet and was briefly inundated by the sea, then covered by new marsh growth that preserved the old surface in an exquisite stratigraphic record. The radiocarbon dating of the buried marsh surfaces pointed to the late 1600s. Meanwhile, historian Kenji Satake in Japan had been puzzling over the 1700 orphan tsunami records and working backward from the tsunami arrival times to constrain the source's timing and location. The two lines of evidence met in the middle: Atwater's buried marshes, Satake's Japanese historical documents, and the tree ring data from ghost forests all confirmed the same date, January 26, 1700, at approximately 9 p.m. Pacific time. The Juan de Fuca plate lurched downward, the North American plate rebounded, the coast subsided, and a wave crossed the Pacific to Japan. Now back to the April 2026 revision and what it means specifically. Previous Cascadia hazard models were built around a plate geometry that placed the locked interface at a particular depth beneath the surface. The seismic waves that travel through rock during an earthquake lose energy as they travel. That energy loss, called attenuation, is the natural dampening effect that reduces shaking with distance from the source. The deeper the earthquake source, the more rock the waves must travel through before reaching the surface, and the more energy they lose in transit. A plate interface 5 kilometers shallower than assumed means seismic waves from a Cascadia rupture have less distance to travel, less attenuation, and arrive at the surface carrying more energy than the models predicted. The researchers confirmed this translates to 9 to 17% more intense ground shaking across affected areas. That is not a marginal revision. In seismic engineering, ground motion intensity is the number that every structural calculation depends on. A 9 to 17% upward revision to the design ground motion is significant enough that structures designed to the old standard may not perform as expected in the actual event. The April 2026 paper also revised two other aspects of the hazard picture in the same direction. The modeling of how shaking amplifies in the deep sedimentary basins underlying Seattle, the Puget Sound lowland, and the Portland metropolitan area was updated to reflect new understanding of basin geometry. And the estimated rupture area for a full margin event was adjusted based on the new plate geometry. Both revisions point toward more severe shaking in exactly the urban areas that house the majority of the Pacific Northwest's population. There is also the May 2026 ABC News coverage of researchers finding tears slicing through the Juan de Fuca plate, including a massive slab that had dropped by more than 3 miles, described by the scientists as evidence of a dying subduction zone. A dying subduction zone does not die quietly or quickly. It is a geological process measured in millions of years. But the physical changes it produces in the plate's geometry add additional stress variability to a fault system already acknowledged to produce earthquakes of extraordinary magnitude. There is a second research development from 2026 that received even less attention than it deserved. A study published in Science Advances earlier this year mapped what the researchers called active protothrusts and fluid highways within the Cascadia system, subduction dynamics that were previously invisible to the seismic imaging techniques available before the 2021 Cascadia Seismic Imaging Experiment. Fluid highways are pathways through which pressurized water moves through the subducting plate as it descends, influencing the coupling between the two plates and the conditions under which rupture initiates. Protothrusts are faults that are in the process of forming, not yet fully developed, at the outer edge of the subduction zone. Their presence changes the understanding of where the locked zone begins and ends, and therefore which communities sit above the most hazard-concentrated portions of the rupture area. The researchers who study the Cascadia Subduction Zone are not alarmists. The Pacific Northwest Seismic Network, which is the scientific authority for regional earthquake research, responded to a prior piece of alarming Cascadia journalism by explicitly urging people not to be scared, but to be prepared. The distinction matters. The science is not arguing that the earthquake is coming tomorrow or that preparation is futile. It is arguing that preparation is essential, that the revised hazard picture makes preparation more urgent than the previous number suggested, and that the gap between what the Pacific Northwest has built and what the Pacific Northwest needs to survive a full margin Cascadia event is specific and measurable. Let me be specific about that gap. FEMA estimates that a magnitude 9.0 Cascadia earthquake would kill an estimated 14,000 people in Oregon and Washington. That estimate was produced before the April 2026 revision increased the expected shaking intensity by 9 to 17%. Portland has 12 bridges crossing the Willamette River. All are expected to sustain damage to varying degrees in a full CSZ event. Several are at risk of partial or complete collapse. Portland's ability to move emergency resources across the river, to evacuate hospitals, to coordinate response between the east and west sides of the city, would be severely compromised if even a subset of those bridges fail. Seattle has a different set of vulnerabilities centered on the floating bridges across Lake Washington, the 520 and I-90 corridors, and the extensive waterfront infrastructure built on fill material that is prone to liquefaction. The same process by which soil loses its strength and begins to behave like a liquid during sustained, intense shaking. Large portions of Seattle's SoDo district, the Duwamish River Valley, and the filled tide flats sit on exactly this kind of material. For the outer coast, the communities directly on the Pacific Ocean, the survival question is not about building codes, it is about time. When a full Cascadia rupture occurs, the shaking itself will tell residents that the tsunami is coming. Strong shaking lasting more than 1 minute, felt on or near the Washington or Oregon coast, is the sign, not the alarm. Not the alarm, not the official warning. The shaking itself is the warning because the physics of the event guarantees that any significant shaking of the outer coast near the subduction zone means a tsunami is already being generated offshore. The expected travel time from the end of shaking to the arrival of the first wave is approximately 15 to 30 minutes for the outer coast communities. Communities like Seaside and Cannon Beach in Oregon, Ocean Shores and Westport in Washington are on flat, low-lying coastal plains with no high ground within walking distance. The maximum run-up heights for a full margin Cascadia tsunami on the outer coast are estimated at 40 to 100 feet in some locations. There is no structure on the outer coast that will survive 40 to 100 feet of inundation. The specific survival intervention for outer coast residents is vertical evacuation before the wave. That means moving to the highest available ground immediately upon feeling the extended shaking, without waiting for any official warning, without returning to any structure, without checking on property. Seaside has invested in tsunami vertical evacuation structures. Reinforced concrete towers built specifically for this scenario. They are the closest thing to a guarantee of survival that exists in a 40-foot wave environment. Knowing where these structures are, practicing the route to them, and knowing that the shaking is the warning to start moving, not the siren, which may come later if at all, are the specific behavioral preparations that the outer coast population needs. For everyone else, for the millions of people in Seattle, Portland, Tacoma, Salem, Eugene, Olympia, and the dozens of cities and towns in between that are not on the outer coast, the tsunami is not the primary risk. The shaking is. 4 to 6 minutes of intense shaking in a region whose building stock includes millions of structures built before modern seismic standards, whose infrastructure includes bridges and elevated highways designed to older specifications, and whose underground utilities, water mains, sewer lines, natural gas pipes, run through neighborhoods where the soil will liquefy during extended shaking, will produce an emergency of a scale and complexity that the Pacific Northwest has no historical experience navigating. So here's the specific answer to the title of this video, because I want to land on something actionable rather than just a picture of the hazard. The scientists are monitoring the Cascadia Subduction Zone. They have been for decades. And the monitoring has consistently revealed new information that points in the same direction. The hazard is more complex, more precisely understood, and in the April 2026 revision, more severe than the prior generation of models reflected. The monitoring is not the terrifying part. The monitoring is the right response to a documented geological hazard. The terrifying part is the gap between what the monitoring is telling us and what the Pacific Northwest has done about it. If you live in the Pacific Northwest, there are specific actions that change your odds in a Cascadia event. Know whether your home was built before or after the 2001 Nisqually earthquake, which is when seismic building codes for the region were significantly strengthened. Pre-2001 residential and commercial construction is generally more vulnerable to sustained intense shaking. Know whether you are on fill, alluvium, or bedrock. Your local county assessor's office and the Washington DNS, or Oregon Hazards Explorer website, have liquefaction hazard maps by address. Know your emergency supplies status. The Pacific Northwest will not receive significant outside assistance for an extended period after a full CSZ event, because the transportation infrastructure that brings aid, roads, bridges, ports, will be compromised across the entire region simultaneously. The standard recommendation is 2 weeks of self-sufficiency, not 72 hours. If you're on the outer coast, know your tsunami vertical evacuation route. Practice it physically at least once. Know that the shaking is the warning. The absence of a siren is not an all clear. For the Shake Alert early warning system, it covers California, Oregon, and Washington. On an M90 Cascadia event, Shake Alert would provide warning times varying from a few seconds for locations close to the coast to potentially 30 to 60 seconds for locations further inland. That time is not enough to evacuate. It is enough to drop, cover, and hold on, the specific posture that protects against the falling debris and structural movement that causes most earthquake injuries. The April 2026 research told us that what we thought we were preparing for was less severe than what is actually coming. That is the result of scientists doing their jobs, of monitoring producing knowledge, and knowledge requiring response. The monitoring is not terrifying. What would be terrifying is if we took the monitoring's findings and did nothing different. That is a choice that individuals, communities, and governments are making right now, in the gap between what the science says and what the preparation looks like. I will be following the Pacific Northwest seismic monitoring data and the preparedness policy response as both continue to develop. Thank you for watching. I will see you in the next one.